Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Let's have a seat real fast, and we'll start the meeting.
The one is right in front of you on the description. I apologize.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I think that we are ready to commence the meeting. It is 9:02 a.m. We are going to open with remarks from Patrick Weber, the Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your first DAC meeting of 2020. Since your last DAC meeting in September, two of your working groups have been working very diligently on examining issues of interest to the FCC and the broader community. One working group, led by Lisa Hamilton of the Hearing Loss Association of America and Mike Strecker of Clear Captions, worked on creating recommended best practices for the registration of IPCTS users in the TRS user registration database. The DAC today will be reviewing the group's recommendations, which include various suggestions for ways to ensure a secure and efficient user registration process for IPCTS. The other working group, led by Christian Vogler of Gallaudet University and Heather York of VITAC, has been diligently working on recommendations for the implementation and use of enhanced electronic newsroom technique and other technologies for captioning of and improvements to local news and other live television programming. We look forward to reviewing that recommendation as soon as it's ready. We believe such work can enhance access to live programming for millions of viewers with disabilities and their families. Before we continue with today's program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the anniversaries of two important disabilities laws. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, on July 26th, and the 10th anniversary of the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, the CVAA, on October 8th. The FCC will join its federal partners and all stakeholders in commemorating these laws this year. As you know, the ADA created a paradigm shift for people with disabilities, offering previously unavailable opportunities in employment, independent living, access to state and local government services, transportation, education, telecommunications, and access to places of public accommodations. The Commission plays a significant role under Title IV of the ADA in ensuring that interstate and intrastate telecommunications relay services are available to the extent possible and in the most efficient manner to Americans who are deaf, hard of hearing, or speech disabled. The CVAA updated federal communications and video programming laws to increase the access of persons with disabilities to modern 21st century communications and technologies. The FCC has broad responsibilities under the CVAA for access to video programming, equipment, advanced communication services, and many other aspects of modern communications. We want to thank each one of you for being a part of the efforts to implement these laws over the years. And thank you again for your commitment to working on the issues in front of the DAC. Your work on the DAC helps to improve the lives of people with disabilities and embodies the spirit of accessibility as outlined by the ADA and the CVAA. With that, I'll turn things over to Diane, who has some remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me already, I'm Diane Burstein. This will be my second DAC meeting since joining CGB as Deputy Bureau Chief in May of 2019. On behalf of CGB and as a former member of previous DACs, I'd like to thank all the DAC members here today for the time and energy that you put in to participate on the DAC and for your efforts on the working groups. We know that you are all volunteering to help with these important tasks on top of your day jobs, and we really appreciate your contributions. As Patrick mentioned, the DAC today will consider recommendation from one working group and hear a progress report from another. I know the FCC's given you some challenging assignments, and we value your input. We also have an interesting discussion about artificial intelligence led by Paul Schrader, and thank you for that, Paul. I also want to thank the dedicated and hardworking team in the Disability Rights Office for their outstanding work developing the DAC agenda, facilitating the working group meetings, and making all the arrangements for the meeting today. A great job, as always. Thank you. And I'd also like to recognize the co-chairs of the DAC, Brian Scarpelli from ACT, the App Association, and Isidore Nyongabo from the National Black Deaf Advocates. Thank you both for your efforts as well. And with those preliminary thank yous, unless you have some questions, let's get to the heart of this morning's meeting. And for that, I'll turn it over to Will Schell, the DAC designated federal officer.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Will Schell, and the heart of the meeting. I'll start off. I have a laundry list of do's and don'ts. So let's start with all of those. So we want to try to follow communication rules that will make this meeting as accessible to everyone as we can. So those rules are to speak slowly and clearly, wait until a co-chair has recognized that you have the floor. One person has the floor at a time. And try to identify yourself before you start to speak. And also, please pause for a few seconds before speaking so that everyone can catch up with the cart or the interpreters. If you're in the room, the Wi-Fi access code is capital F, capital C, 823302. I want to extend my thanks to the FCC staff who helped set up the room and help get breakfast on the table and who are running around behind the scenes. Thanks to all of the DRO staff who's doing that. And then the bathrooms are just out the door on the right. Follow the wall to your left, and when you reach the first hallway, take a left. The first bathroom on the left, the first door on the left is the men's, and the second door on the left is the women's. This program is being live streamed, and if you're watching on the web, you can ask questions by sending an email to livequestions@fcc.gov. That's livequestions with an S, all one word, at fcc.gov. And at the end of the agenda, we will hear from the public and go through those. If we do any voting today, it will be by roll call. So we'll just essentially go around the room and every person will announce their vote. And then finally, the most important housekeeping thing is lunch. Lunch will be happening. And this meeting's open to the public, so I always like to announce that the lunch is not open to the public. That if you're on the DAC, or if you are an alternate DAC member, or if you're assisting in this meeting in some ways, then you can feel free to have lunch. The lunch sponsor, thank you very much to ACT, the App Association, represented by our very own co-chair, Brian Scarpelli. Thank you, Brian. And with that, the actual meeting can get started. I'll pass this back to Isidore Nyongabo to start the meeting.
Good morning again. And before we go to roll call, I'd like to share two important announcements about the meeting. We are going to be having a vote on one recommendation proposed by a working group, and that proposal will be read in summary. We will also hear from Paul Schrader, is going to guide us in a discussion on artificial intelligence, or AI, and how that may impact people with disabilities. With that said, I think we'll get started with roll call. So we'll start off to my left. Hi, good morning. I'm Deborah Patkin. I'm the Deputy Designated Federal Officer. Hey, good morning, everyone. Susie Rosen Singleton, Chief of the Disability Rights Office.
Do I have sound? Yeah, good. Good morning, everybody. This is Elliot Greenwald, Deputy Chief Disability Rights Office at the FCC.
This is Sarah Malaire with the American Foundation for the Blind.
Darlene Parker with the National Captioning Institute.
Michael Maddox, Sorensen Communications.
Good morning, everybody. Michael Strecker with Clear Captions.
Good morning, Beth Slough with Hamilton Relay.
Thanks. Hi, good morning, everybody. Tony Stevens with the American Council of the Blind.
Joshua Pila representing NAB.
Rochelle Garrell, National Association for State Relay Administration.
Sam Yale, Level Access.
Everett Bacon, National Federation of the Blind.
Gay Jones, FEMA.
Tim Cregan, U.S. Access Board. Good morning, everyone.
Lisa Hamlin, Hearing Loss Association of America.
Linda Cosmas Vitek, Gallaudet University.
Brianne Berger, the U.S. Department of Education. Hello, good morning. Brian Traeger, National Institute of Technology for the Deaf. Good morning, this is Zainab Al-Kebsi with the National Association for the Deaf. Hello, everyone. I am Claude Stout. I'm with Telecommunications for the Deaf, Inc. Thank you. Jeff Rosen with Convo. Good morning. Greg Leibach with CSD-VRS, renamed to ZP, Better Together. So we need to replace my nameplate for the next time.
Carl Richardson with the City of Boston.
Good morning. This is Heather York from VITAC.
Linda Vanderloop, AT&T.
Paul Schrader, IRA.
Sarah Legan with CTIA, alternate for Kara Graves at CTIA.
Rachel Nemeth, CTA.
Good morning. Joel Snyder, Audio Description Associates and Audio Description Project of the American Council of the Blind.
Morning. Dennis Selznick, Sprint.
Diane Burstein, CGB.
This is Will Shell, the Designated Federal Officer for the Disability Advisory Committee.
This is Brian Scarpelli with ACT the App Association, also co-chair here. Hi, everyone.
Isidore Nyangabo with NBDA and co-chair for the committee. Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to a very productive meeting today. And moving on, I'd like to introduce Susie Rosen Singleton, who is going to update us on the Disability Rights Office, and I will turn it over to her. Subsequently, we'll hear from Elliot Greenwald about TRS issues. Hello, everyone. Good morning and happy 2020. I echo, of course, all the comments about how fortunate we are to have this group. I know that you've really made a huge difference in our rulemakings at the FCC and our activities, so we want to thank you for all the work that you do, all the important feedback that you provide. And we have been very busy too, and thanks at least in part to all of your feedback. And I'm going to provide some highlights of our office's work, then hand it over to Elliot to talk about telecommunications relay services. We last met on September 24th, so I'm going to be giving you some updates that have taken place since then. I'll start out with audio description. On October 7th, the FCC granted a limited waiver to NBC Universal, as well as USA Networks that is owned by NBC Universal, of the Commission's audio description rules. As long as USA Network airs at least 1,000 hours of described programming each quarter, without regard to the number of repeats, and describes at least 75% of newly produced non-live programming that is aired between 6 a.m. and midnight per quarter. However, the FCC declined to grant NBC Universal's proposed safe harbor from the audio description requirements for other similarly situated networks. Our second audio description update is on October 9th. The FCC released a second report to Congress about audio description. This is required by the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, or CVAA. The purpose of that report is to provide information about audio description, including the amount and types of described video programming and the need for additional described programming. That report recognizes that the CVAA does provide the Commission with the authority to phase in audio description regulations for up to 10 designated market areas annually, starting October 8th of 2020. The report also states that we do plan to release a public notice this year to consider whether the cost of such an expansion in markets would be reasonable. So we'll be keeping you updated when that moves forward. Moving on to accessible communications, we have two highlights under that heading. The first, on December 16th, the FCC released a notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to establish a new 3-digit code, 988, for National Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Crisis Hotline. That comment period closes March 16th of 2020. Some consumer organizations have submitted comments in that proceeding about the accessibility of that hotline. And I want to ensure that we are considering texting or direct video calling as methods for contacting that. So those comments from some of you have been helpful in shedding light on the accessibility concerns of that 988 hotline. Secondly, we also released a public notice to announce the membership of the North American Numbering Council, or NANCY, N-A-N-C, established a interoperable video calling working group. This was on February 3rd, and that NANCY was established to advise the Commission on numbering issues to ensure that we have efficient and impartial number administration. The mission of the IVC working group under the NANCY is to explore how to facilitate the provision of interoperable telephone number-based video calling, allowing for one 10-digit number to make a video call to any other 10-digit number. That working group is co-chaired by representatives who have both been here, at least in the past, David Bahar, who represents the National Association of State Relay Administrators, and now is working as the Director of Telecommunications Access of Maryland, and Chris Wendt, who's the Director of the Technical Research and Development at Comcast for their communications platforms. So many folks also serve on the DAC as well as the IVC, like Apple, AT&T, Charter Communications, the City of Los Angeles. Many of you may know Richard Ray, who was a past co-chair of the DAC and is now a member of the working group. Convo, ZP Better Together, CTIA, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, Google, Sorensen, Sprint, Telnix. It is really a wonderful group with lots of great representatives there to look into this issue, and they have been asked to submit a report to the Commission by July 29th. DRO has 2 facilitators for that working group, Robert McConnell, who is here in the room, and Michael Scott, who is also here. So thanks to them for all of their work on that working group. Moving on to HAC, or hearing aid compatibility, I want to share that we do have a proposed rulemaking that was released on January 30th. We have not established a comment period for that yet, as I'm sure some of you well know, but there are 2 major proposals as part of that item. The first is to require exclusive use of the new 2019 ANSI standards, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, as a standard for evaluating hearing aid compatibility after a 2-year transition period is complete, and to extend the Commission's current volume control deadline to harmonize with the start of that use in the 2019 standard. And we have also proposed to update the labeling requirements so that consumers have the information they need in order to be able to evaluate whether a new phone will be hearing aid compatible for them. That comment period should be announced as soon as it is available. Moving on to captioning. We have a petition that's currently out for comment about Pluto TV, who requested a temporary waiver from our rules for closed captioning of video programming delivered through internet protocol on certain platforms only. And the comment period has been extended twice. It was originally November 7th. It was extended again to March 6th. And as some of you know, I know that comments have already been submitted by some of you who are here, so thank you for those. Finally, I also wanted to share with you what we have done in terms of outreach in the Disability Rights Office. We released a PN on February 12th to remind service providers and equipment manufacturers to maintain records of their efforts to make telecommunication services and equipment and advanced communication services and equipment, as well as internet browsers built into mobile phones accessible to people with disabilities, as required by FCC rule. The certification must be filed annually by April 1st. So we released that public notice advising those providers who are covered by our rules of that upcoming obligation. And finally, as you know, many of us are out there trying to engage with all stakeholders. We want to highlight that we have been involved with a rural road tour. This past month, we presented in Arizona and New Mexico remotely. Thanks to technology access. We did not have to fly out there, so we're looking forward to doing more of that type of outreach as well. We think that's very effective, and it went very, very well, having video access there to be able to engage with those parties who were asking questions. And many folks in those areas didn't even really know what the FCC did, so we got to a very basic need for basic information and kind of high-level outreach there. We hope to also be participating in Arkansas and Louisiana in March, and we're looking forward to more of those opportunities. Please do let us know if you have some interest in that. We'll be happy to provide you with more information. We also have our ASL videos. I'm not sure if you have noticed, but was announced on Twitter yesterday. We have released a new ASL video, How to File a Complaint with the Commission. April Jackson, who is usually here in the room helping out with some logistics. You'll see her probably at lunch as well, was the signer for that video. She is our ASL call taker here at DRO. And last but not least, we have an online complaint system that we are continuing to update. We have heard you. You've given us some strong feedback about that system that we need to make it more consumer friendly, and so we have added more language to our online system to be friendly to consumers to ensure that your complaint is received and to make sure that you get timely information about what the next steps are for processing your complaints. That's very important to us, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you on that. So thank you so much. I would certainly welcome any questions, but I will also pass it over to Elliot to do his TRS update first. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susie. I'll go over a few of the things that have happened regarding TRS since the last meeting. In fact, the day after the last meeting on September 25th, CGB released a public notice seeking comment on a request for limited waiver filed by BTC Secure, an applicant for certification to provide IPCTS of certain provisions of the Commission's rules setting mandatory minimum standards applicable to communications assistance handling TRS calls when IPCTS calls are processed using automatic speech recognition technology without the presence of a CA. And that comment period closed on October 21st. On October 30th, CGB released an order extending the VRS at-home call handling pilot program until April 30th of 2020, and more on that in a moment. On November 4th, CGB released a public notice inviting comment on a request for clarification or waiver filed by Sorensen, who is seeking clarification that enterprise and public video phones used to access VRS are not subject to the rule requiring the administrator of the TRS user registration database, known as TRS-URD, which we'll have some discussion on later, to remove the data of any user who has neither placed nor received a VRS or point-to-point call in a one-year period. In the alternative, Sorensen seeks waiver of this requirement. Sorensen also seeks clarification that in instances where the all-call query function of the TRS numbering directory fails to validate a VRS user who is indeed registered in the TRS-URD, a VRS provider may complete the VRS call and seek a waiver for compensation of such calls in certain circumstances. In addition, Sorensen requests clarification that point-to-point video calls are not subject to the all-call query rule. And lastly, Sorensen seeks guidance on how a direct video calling, known as DVC provider, is to effectuate a transfer of a DVC call to VRS and on the form of on-screen menu option for DVC or VRS that may be provided to consumers who call a single unified DVC customer support number. And the comment period on that petition closed on December 19th. Moving on to November 25th, the Commission released a report and order modifying the cost recovery rules for IPCTS so that providers of intrastate voice communication services must contribute to the TRS fund for the support of IPCTS. By expanding the TRS fund contribution base, the Commission reduced the burden on providers of interstate service and ensured the long-term sustainability of this vital service. The rule change became effective on February 5th, and as a result, for the TRS fund year beginning July 1st of this year, IPCTS will be funded by the expanded contribution base. Also, on November 25th, the Commission released a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on updating its suspension and debarment rules to make them consistent with Office of Management and Budget guidelines in order to better prevent bad actors from participating in USF, TRS, and the National Deafblind Equipment Distribution Program. Comments were due on February 13th, and reply comments will be due on March 16th, so there's still an opportunity to participate in the formal comment period. Then on December 16th, CGB released a public notice seeking comment on a petition filed by Sorensen to stay the effectiveness of Section 64.621A3 of the Commission's rules, which requires VRS providers to ensure that their VRS access technologies and video communication service platforms are interoperable with the Video Access Technology Reference Platform, known as the VATR-P, in accordance with the interoperability profile for relay user equipment, known as the RU profile. Say that 10 times fast. The compliance deadline of this rule is April 29th, 2020. Sorensen requests that the rule be stayed until the Bureau addresses Sorensen's petition for reconsideration of the order adopting the RU profile, and the comment period on that ended on December 23rd. Moving on to 2020, on January 13th, CGB released a public notice announcing February 10th, 2020 as the effective date of an earlier adopted rule modification updating the definition of TRS, and January 30th, 2020 as the comment deadline, and February 13th, 2020 as the reply comment deadline for an earlier adopted further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on the elimination of requirements for equal access and billing options for long-distance TRS calls, and the elimination of the requirement to publish in the Federal Register notice of applications for certification of state relay programs. Those notices will still be published in the, if this is adopted, would still be published through the normal Daily Digest release process. Then on January 31st, the Commission released a report and order adopting regulations making permanent the VRS at-home call handling pilot program by amending the Commission's rules to permit authorized VRS providers to let CAs handle calls at home workstations subject to safeguards designed to maintain service quality, protect call confidentiality, and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. Other than the definitional changes, these rules will not take effect until after the Commission receives the Paperwork Reduction Act approval from the Office of Management and Budget. On February 14th, CGB released a public notice announcing that on February 7th, Purple notified the Commission that effective February 15th, it surrendered its conditional certification to provide VRS and withdrew its application for certification to provide VRS. Purple has since become a wholly owned subsidiary of CSD VRS, LLC, which has since changed its name, as Greg mentioned, to ZP Better Together, LLC, and continues to provide VRS under the sub-brands ZVRS and Purple, pursuant to its conditional certification to provide VRS. And lastly, on February 21st, CGB released a public notice announcing February 19th as the effective date for certain rule modifications subject to approval by the Office of Management and Budget pursuant to the Paperwork Reduction Act. They're adopted in the 2018 IPCTS Modernization Order relating to the provision and marketing of IPCTS, and the 2019 IPCTS Program Management Order relating to rules established for the submission of IPCTS user registration information to the TRS URD. So with that, I conclude the TRS portion of the report, and are there any questions for either Susie or me?
Tim? Tim, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you, Elliot, and thank you, Susie, for those very comprehensive, detailed reports. I'll just have a follow-up question for Susie, if I may. Susie, one of the items you mentioned was the hearing aid compatibility proposed rulemaking filed on January 30th. And you made reference to an ANSI standard for evaluation. Could you tell us what the name of the standard is, or the citation number for that, please?
Hi. Thank you, Tim. This is Susie speaking. Yes, we adopted the notice of proposed rulemaking item on January 30th. The standard that we proposed to require after this 2-year transition period is called the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI standard. And I'd be happy to give you the citation number later on. I also know we have two very, very well-versed people in the room as well from HLAA and Gallaudet's Technology Access Program who are involved in that, so I'm not sure. It seems like Linda may want to chime in.
Right, the standard is The standard is C63.19.
Thank you. Follow-up question. So just briefly, what does the standard address?
It addresses, well, it involves the testing of wireless devices in terms of their hearing aid compatibility with hearing aids. So that includes RF emissions testing, testing for telecoil coupling capability, and now volume control requirements. And then on the hearing device side, their hearing aids are tested for their radio frequency immunity. So immunity to the emissions of the wireless device.
Thank you.
And if I could. Yeah, I would like to add to that. I understand the standard also modifies the ratings to simplify the ratings for consumers because the current system, the ratings can be very confusing for consumers. So that is another element of the ANSI standard.
Thank you.
Jim?
Just one more point of clarification. You mentioned volume control requirements. Is there anything in the new standard about seeking a baseline volume for wireless devices? Is there anything about that?
So the volume control requirement in the standard actually references another standard, an ANSI TIA standard. And yes, it does address the idea of a baseline. I'd probably like to follow up with you further on that question to make sure that we are talking about the same thing, but yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that discussion, that update from DRO. Now we'd like to move on with our agenda to a report and recommendation from the working group on the Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service user registration database. With co-chairs of that group, Lisa Hamlin from Hearing Loss Association of America and Mike Strecker with Clear Captions. And the report is going to be read as a summary. The recommendation itself will be read in its entirety, and then we will need a motion to vote. I'll turn it over to the co-chairs.
Hello, this is Lisa Hamlin, co-chair with Mike Strecker of the IPCTS URD committee. What I will be reading aloud, so you know, is actually on your, it should be in front of you. I believe there are accessible versions for people who need, is that correct, Will? Yes. So if anybody needs an accessible version in Braille or large print also, yes, we have everything for you, so you can follow along. But because this is a long recommendation and introduction, I am not reading the full introduction. I'm reading the page 1 only. It's not really a summary. It's a bit of a summary, but you can read the entire introduction, which is valuable. It gives you our thoughts of why as a group, we put together these recommendations. And I want to also start up thanking Mike Strecker. I want to thank Michael Scott, the FCC liaison, and the whole working group who worked really hard and worked together really well to provide these recommendations. So that's just a start. So I'm also going to trade off with Mike Strecker, so you don't have to only listen to my voice for these recommendations, just to break up the sound for those who can hear. And then that way you can maybe be able to get access to the whole thing more easily. So with that, here's the recommendation. Recommendation of the Federal Communications Commission Disability Advisory Committee, Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service, User Registration Database Working Group. The objective: with developed recommendations and best practices for the registration of Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service users in the Telecommunications Relay Services User Registration Database. Introduction and background. These recommendations are intended to provide guidance to the Commission on the implementation of the provisions of its February 2019 report and order expanding the User Registration Database, URD, created for Video Relay Services, VRS, to include users of Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service, IPCTS. Informed by a series of briefings from consumer organizations, telecommunications relay services, TRS providers, and Roca Loeb, the Commission's third-party contractor who is currently the TRS URD administrator. The working group identified 3 critical issues to address in implementing the expansion of the URD to IPCTS. Logistical burdens. The registration process raises the prospect of unnecessary delays, paperwork, and other roadblocks that could deter legitimate IPCTS users from completing registration for service they need by imposing unreasonable burdens on providers and consumers. Bullet 2. Consumer privacy. The registration process raises risks to the privacy of consumers through the collection, use, retention, and sharing of personally identifying information. Bullet 3, registration-related costs. The registration process requires providers to engage in more direct interactions with users, raising the prospect of higher costs for each user registration. The working group collected substantial information from subject matter experts about how these issues have arisen in the implementation of the TRS URD for VRS and how lessons learned in the VRS context can be applied to the IPCTS TRS URD. I'm now going to turn it over to Mike to talk about the first two recommendations. So he will read those out.
Thank you, Lisa. Am I there? Can y'all hear me? Hello? Hello? Working? Thank you, Lisa. I also wanted to thank everybody who played a role in compiling these recommendations and for all the work that they put forth in producing it. Moving on directly to the recommendations, which start on page 6, if you've got the handout. Now, therefore, it is, 1, recommended that the Commission not issue the public notice indicating that the URD is ready to receive user registration information for IPCTS users until the Commission addresses the pending further notice of proposed rulemaking and conducts a further rulemaking proceeding on the recommendations that follow. 2, recommended that the Commission take necessary action to limit the logistical burdens of the IPCTS URD, including A, provide a 2-year data submission period to register existing users after the IPCTS URD activation date, B, conduct a clear and straightforward outreach and education campaign to inform consumers about the IPCTS URD process and requirements to use the service. C, facilitate lifetime registration for users by ensuring that users need not re-register when porting to a different provider or being assigned a subsequent 10-digit number, including Roman numeral 1, give providers a mechanism to determine whether a user is already registered and rely upon the existing registration to satisfy URD requirements. And Roman numeral 2, once a customer is registered within the TRS URD, require the TRS URD administrator to maintain the customer's URD account for a period of time that matches the current customer account record-keeping requirements providers are expected to follow. D, revise the list of validation documentation to Roman numeral 1, allow the use of expired identification documents, for example, driver's license, passport, military ID, state issue ID, etc. Roman numeral 2, add additional documentation types that are acceptable to clear failed risk codes, for example, medical bills, rental agreements, and Roman numeral 3, clarify the details of specific acceptable documentation types, for example, what constitutes a utility bill. E, require the TRS URD administrator to, Roman numeral 1, work with IPCTS providers, consumer groups, and the Commission to evaluate whether or not the use of LexisNexis's Instant ID Index Score could be used to sufficiently and reasonably validate a user's identity. Roman numeral 2, provide advance notice to providers of any planned LexisNexis maintenance outages to prevent problems with submissions. And Roman numeral 3, use real-time application programming interfaces, APIs, for registration submissions and responses. F, allow compensation for minutes of use incurred by a user while a registration appeal is pending. G, resolve all user registration appeals within 30 days. H, after the IPCTS URD activation date, permit providers to provide service and be compensated for minutes of use for up to 30 days while new users are pending URD approval. I, remove obstacles to a consumer's ability to have an appropriate IPCTS device at each location where that user needs its use by Roman numeral 1, allowing providers to install IPCTS devices in transient or enterprise environments where more than one person with hearing loss who meets the Commission's eligibility requirements for IPCTS and needs the use of an IPCTS device for accessible telecommunications. Roman numeral 2, allow facilities with stable as well as transient populations to provide IPCTS phones to qualified people with hearing loss. Roman numeral 3, establishing guidelines and adopting procedures to allow registration for enterprise IPCTS devices. Roman numeral 4, recognizing the 5 variables, full legal name, address, date of birth, last 4 of social security number, phone number, required for registration. When at least one item is unique, the submission should be recognized as another user. Roman numeral 5. If an individual has more than one electronic serial number, ESN, or IPCTS device, requiring that all ESNs and devices be tied to the same user. Roman numeral 6. Allowing for the possibility that if there are 2 certified users in one household, there may be one ESN, or individual ID, tied to both users, or there may be multiple IPCTS devices tied to one household. Roman numeral 7, providing guidelines for the certification process for those with power of attorney or guardianship, or for people under the age of 18. And Roman numeral 8, allowing for scenarios such as enterprise and transient environments where a user may give a different work/room phone extension for an inbound call, but outgoing calls may go out under several possible trunk lines. And in those scenarios, once registration is validated, ensure that the URD approves the call by the individual ID or ESN. And Roman numeral 9, establishing a process to address minors becoming the age of majority, including allowing a grace period for minors to become fully compliant as if they were newly registered users. And with that, I complete the second recommendation, and I am going to be handing the microphone back to Lisa.
So we're moving on to recommendation number 3. Recommended that the Commission take necessary action to limit harms to consumer privacy resulting from the implementation of the IPCTS URD, including A, require the TRS URD administrator to, Roman numeral 1, establish internal policies and procedures that ensure data security. Roman numeral 2, adopt a record retention schedule that causes the Commission, providers, and the TRS URD administrator to retain records only as long as necessary to fulfill the requirements of the URD and destroy records immediately thereafter. Roman numeral 3, update vendor agreements with any third parties involved in the administration of URD, including LexisNexis, to, number 1, limit retention of data given to vendors by the TRS URD administrator to the time period necessary to fulfill their obligations under the agreements. Number 2, prohibit the sale or commercial use of data given to the vendor by the TRS URD administrator. Number 3, prohibit any use of the data given to the vendor by the TRS URD administrator beyond the narrow specified purposes in the agreements. And number 4, notify the TRS URD administrator and the Commission in the event of a breach within 30 days of discovery. Roman numeral 4, designate an official agent to conduct internal audits and ensure internal compliance. And Roman numeral 5, provide notice of data collection and use in clear, understandable language to be passed by providers to their customers. B, ensure Privacy Act compliance by Roman numeral 1, articulating requirements for the TRS URD administrator, identity verification agents, and other third parties used by the TRS URD administrator in the administration and the operation of the URD. Roman numeral 2, adopting procedures to ensure, number 1, individuals' access to records. Number 2, notice of collection and use. Number 3, disclosure of the purpose of the collection. Number 4, the name and location of relevant systems being used. Number 5, categories of records in the relevant systems. Number 6, security safeguards. Number 7, amendment procedures. And number 8, all other measures to comply with the Act. C, limit the period that providers and the TRS administrators must maintain documents by requiring the TRS URD administrator to complete audits of supporting documentation only to the extent necessary for the registration validation in a prescribed period. D, to extend that the TRS URD administrator requires copies of supporting documentation, require the transmission of those documents and storage of those documents by the TRS URD administrator to be secured using reasonable and appropriate security measures, including end-to-end encryption in transit and encryption at rest. E, require transmission and storage of personal user data, including supporting documents, to or by the TRS URD administrator to be subject to a data transfer agreement between the provider and the TRS URD administrator that ensures reasonable and appropriate security measures, including end-to-end transcription in transit and encryption at rest, and including security audit rights for providers. F, require providers and the TRS URD administrator to purge all supporting documentation upon the earlier of either approval of the application or 30 days after submission, regardless of audit completion. G, in all other practical ways, minimizing retention requirements for all data collected for the URD. H, limit non-real-time validation requirements to circumstances where specific registrant's information gives rise to a specific articulable suspension that he or she is attempting to register fraudulently. Roman numeral 1, where possible, limit information used for verification to metadata rather than personally identifiable information. For example, rely on information that says the person is located in the United States rather than their address, or rely on information that says DOB matches rather than list the DOB or include a copy of the driver's license. And J, temporary approval should be granted if the URD administrator submits a code that signifies they have collected an appropriate corrective document. Roman numeral 1, in the event of a validation failure, bullet point 1, provider uploads document to a secure storage system for URD administrator's review. Bullet 2, once URD administrator has accepted the registrations and a unique identifier has been issued, URD administrator shall approve or sign off on the registration, and then the document must be purged. Recommendation number 4. Recommended that the Commission address registration of related costs of the IPCTS URD by allowing providers to receive an exogenous cost adjustment for incurred URD-related costs. And that is the entirety of the recommendations and the first page of our introduction. So I turn it back over to the chair for any questions. And again, thank you to the whole committee. I mean, people worked really hard and really well drafting this and putting it together.
Greg?
Thank you. Great. Thank you to the working group. What an excellent job of identifying the issues and listing them for us, putting together with your thoughts on the process and providing us through your review, providing us that experience and your thoughts for the things that we were working on. And we, as a provider, support this recommendation without question. As providers and customers do not want, because VRS providers and IPCTS providers and consumers have the same issues, and they want to avoid the same issues as well. So the URD that's based on the current VRS URD and working through years and years of improving what we have now, and your summary provided and identified the correct issues that we have been thinking about. And the points of these issues is that there is too much uncertainty. Too much uncertainty that continues with this process from provider to provider, and consumers that continues to go around and be passed on is this sense of uncertainty. And putting that burden on the provider, for example, the on-call queries, the ACQ. So documenting that as a requirement in the rules. We are spending 11 hours to argue the removal of that requirement in order to go forward and to make our submissions appropriately. And we have an army of staff that is ready and available to focus on the URD. So we don't need to put a search out in order to recruit people from the company in order to invest our time and energy and money to focus on those URD requirements. And we know that this is a really painful, both for the providers and the consumers, that heavy burden and investment that's necessary. There's a lot of time spent trying to move the ball forward, to catch up and figure out what these requirements are. And spending more time focusing on innovation is what we want. More time focusing on consumers is what we want, instead of trying to figure out a moving target that is consistently uncertain. So I think that there's enough said, but I just wanted to put out here that I'm very supportive of this, because I want IPCTS and the consumers to have a different experience that VRS went through. Thank you.
Great, we'll go to Tim.
Thank you. Tim Cregan, U.S. Access Board. I would also like to really give my heartiest congratulations and applause to this working group for the level of detail and the amount of specificity you put into this proposal and to these recommendations. This is extremely helpful. You've done a very good job of laying out the issues, and it's, someone approaching it can get a really, really good sense of what the issues are. Having said that, I understand and appreciate Greg's comments, because I understand that the overriding purpose of all of this is to improve service for the consumers. Sometimes the devil is in the details, and you do have to focus on the specific operational requirements. So I think that the document's emphasis on the supporting materials that are used to qualify people for this program is an appropriate emphasis. And it is something that we in government also deal with. The use of personally identifiable information is an issue of concern throughout. And I appreciate very much that this group has put in these statements and qualifications for this. Having said that, I do have 3 specific items that I'd like to flag, just because I had questions and maybe I didn't, maybe I misread this. But first, the 2 on page 7, which are mostly editorial. If you were to look at item I, talking about removing obstacles to a consumer's ability, and then it talks about Roman sub 1, allowing providers to install ICT, IP, CTS devices. And it goes on and it's describing the person with hearing loss who meets the condition, blah, 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 blah. But then I was looking for, it seemed like there was a word missing here after one person with hearing loss residing in this facility or present in this facility, or what is their connection? Because all the other things talk about the facilities or tie into where the service is provided. So I was just curious when I read this, because you're talking about an environment where more than one person with hearing loss exists, uses, registers, what? I wasn't sure if there was a missing word. Okay.
So this is Lisa. I think what probably not written the way a novelist would, but it is, I think what we point to is the person with a hearing loss who needs the use of IPCTS. Maybe it could have been written a little bit better, but I think that's the point. The person, whether they, that person needs the use and I guess is in that facility,
Okay.
is how we were looking at it.
But I was particularly drawn to that language because later you made a distinction between users whose information was centered around their residence address, so their service was being provided to their residents, and then there were other examples where the service was being provided to their business, and then you brought up the issue of several people using the same business phone number, and then you went into great detail to point out how sometimes the ingoing and outgoing numbers differed. So, having given all that detail, which I applaud, this particular phrase just, was not clear. I appreciate your clarification. I think that maybe you could make that change or tweak that just to make it clear. Secondly, also on page 7, G talks about resolve all user registration appeals within 30 days. So I was curious, 30 days of what? Of the initial submission, of the adoption of these recommendations? I wasn't sure. What 30 days? When does the 30-day period start? What triggers the 30 days? I was just curious.
Thank you. I believe it was meant 30 days from submission of the appeal.
Okay, I would just suggest maybe you put in clarifying language, whatever that is. Thank you. And now for the third item that I have, back on page 6. Okay, looking at 2, subpart D, talking about revising the list of validation documentation. And Roman 1 says, allow the use of expired identification documents, e.g. driver's license, passport, military ID, state-issued ID, etc. Okay, so when I read that, that kind of leapt out to me. In the private sector, the issue of real ID is a very valid and ongoing issue. I will say that state departments of motor vehicles are focusing on the real ID requirement, and they're imposing it on everybody who seeks to get either the driver's license or who seeks to get state-issued identification. I know from personal experience, having dealt with my then 92-year-old father, who showed up at DMV, and he had all of that expired documentation, passports, user IDs, work IDs, everything. And they looked at him and said, no, we can't use this. You have to go back and get a copy of your birth certificate, your social security card, and some other identification, including a bill and proof of where you live. And I said, he's 92 years old, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't care. the point was everybody follows the same requirements. The concern is fraud and theft of services. So I'm particularly struck by the exception here. I guess I would ask the committee members for clarification why you chose that. And I'm suggesting, based on my own experience, if the suggestion is many of the users are over 65 and this is going to be a burden, it's no different from the burden they're going to face at DMV when they go to get a non-driver's identification license. So I'm just asking for clarification on that point. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Good question. So I think the intent there was, well, couple-fold. Number one, as IPCTS providers, we're not required to collect that identification for every individual. It is only for those users who fail validation through LexisNexis or LexisNexis's identity validation system for whatever reason. The reality is most of our customers are seniors, and a lot of times their driver's licenses, they've let them expire with no intent to renew them, possibly because they just simply can't drive any longer. So this was to protect those individuals who are unable to meet that requirement.
This is Lisa Hamlin. And I would add, it's one thing if you're asking a citizen to fly on an airplane and you want to make sure that those citizens or drive a car or whatever. You want to validate those citizens. To me, IPCTS is a civil right, and as a civil right, we shouldn't be making them jump through so many hoops, especially, some of these people are 100 years old, and you're making them jump through so many hoops that you're not allowed access to this civil right, to me, is an affront. It doesn't mean that, we can still make sure these people have valid, they're a real person, they're not trying to defraud the system. That we're totally with that. But we don't want to deny people a civil right. And I think that's where, certainly from the consumer side, that's where we were coming from.
This is Tim. So thank you for those comments. I still think, like I mentioned before, the fact that you're over 65 or the fact that you're, in your golden years really doesn't matter to DMV, and it's the documents are there. You can get them. You can track them down. I do appreciate the idea that this could be a burden and this could be burdensome to people, but I'm just concerned that something which is being granted to people on the basis of identity has a big, wide open door for identity, because it's very possible people use false IDs for whatever reason. I'm not saying I want to deny people their civil rights, but I'm saying I want this to be a validatable process. And if you say you can use false IDs or expired IDs without checking it, I don't know. I think that leaves you open to some criticism, potentially. That's all.
Okay, so go ahead. This is Lisa Hammer. I'd like to just respond. So my question is, for these three issues, are you suggesting an amendment that we would have to look at?
Sure. Okay, so I would suggest for page 7, I believe for G, I believe Mike had some language for the 30-day period. He said it to the room, so whatever he said, I'm totally fine with it. It was something about the beginning of the application. Whatever you said, I'm fine with that. For H1 sub 1, I would just ask that either that the relationship and what's going on be a little more clear. So this paragraph going, where more than one person with hearing loss receives services, or something like that, who meets the commission's eligibility and needs the requirements for telecommunications is found, or whatever. The reason being is because elsewhere you talk about the distinction between residence and workplace. So whatever you want to use there, I would just be consistent. I'm not, worried about that. And then finally, with item 6, okay, I'm not voting on this because I'm ex officio. This would never pass, okay, on document requirements because, and giving people a break because they're old and sick or whatever, I think is insulting. I mean, I'm just saying as a point. My father was old and any other category you want to do, but he got the requirements. You've pointed out the other issues that are wrong with this system in terms of the delay to reinstate, the fact that it only gets uploaded an hour a day, and it's a delay in people's time. I think, given the fact that in the rest of their lives, people are aware of the real ID requirements, which are being implemented everywhere across the country, I think that if you had ID requirements consistent with that, I don't think people can see that as burdensome or onerous, because that is what's going on in the rest of the country. Why should you allow expired IDs for this entity? I get that the main method for checking this is through the LexisNexis. Okay, so perhaps this should be reworded to say that the primary means of identification shall be through checks of the LexisNexis database, and assuming you pass this, then there's an expedited processing. For those entities that cannot be found in LexisNexis database or cannot be confirmed, then there'll be a secondary process, which is really the issue you're getting to, because your time slow is not the people that can be gone through Lexis. They go through fairly quickly. It's the people who fail that or who aren't in that. So really, I think this identification document issue, that's really for the exception case. Because as Mike said, the main means of identification and the main requirement is LexisNexis. So put that first, and then say, for the exception where they don't meet the LexisNexis requirement, we shall institute procedures for additional verification of documents, which could include Real ID or something like that. You know what I mean? I wouldn't put this first, because that kind of, first of all, it imposes an undue burden on you, and it's exceeding what the requirements are, because you just said the requirements are only that it has to meet LexisNexis. So just say that first, and this would become an exception. So that would be my suggestion.
Hi, Mike here. Sorry, I'm thinking through how to respond. So that currently is the process that's used by the fund administrator or the URD administrator is LexisNexis. If it fails, documentation. And I think in the VRS world, I've heard, and I hate to quote this because I'll probably be wrong, but about 1 out of 3 people failed the LexisNexis validation process, which leaves, while it's an exception, it's a materially significant group of people that fall in that category. I think the other reality is for the driver's licenses that are collected in video relay service, for example, and as part of the URD, there is no Real ID requirement. And frankly, there's no validation that the driver's license that's collected is a valid one other than it appears valid. Meaning there's no external third-party checks that take place to make sure it's a real ID, it's a photocopy of it. I'm struggling in terms of how to respond to the overall question. I get it. But at the same time, we're just trying to Lisa's point, not make this unduly burdensome to that 30% that fall through because LexisNexis didn't realize they moved in the last 3 months from their own home to an assisted living apartment and their addresses don't match or anything like that, and all they've got is an expired driver's license and they don't have any other documentation. And now we're forcing them, well, you need to go get your birth certificate or some other process to validate their identity, when the reality is they've got an expired driver's license, they're 87 years old. Why can't that be sufficient to say, this is a person in an assisted living facility, this is their address, this is their phone number, here's a picture of them, here's their expired driver's license. Should that not be sufficient to grant them access to what, frankly, to Lisa's point, is a civil right? But with that said, I don't know, Lisa, if there's anything you want to add to that.
This is Lisa. Let me just say that it's not just, it's a matter of if somebody is disabled, you're asking, but they still want to be able to talk to their son. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, this is Susie. Great, thank you. This is Susie speaking. I really want to ask to please remember the ground rules here. Isidore would need to recognize you before you take the floor to speak. I'm not specifically Lisa, but a reminder for everyone, and Isidore will moderate and call on individuals. So please do wait until you've been recognized so that we can manage the discussion. So then I'll send it back to Isidore. Thank you. I want to give an opportunity for Jeff Rosen and Paul to chime in, who have been waiting, and we're quickly running short on time. So if you could briefly get to your comment or question, then we can try to move on. Jeff?
My name is Jeff Rosen. I'm with Convo Communications. So listening to this recent discussion, I think, is a great example of really getting into the rabbit hole, into the weeds, as we have been doing about the URD. It is a very complex process. And we can feel frustrated by that, like we see in our recent discussion. And these are the feelings that we have had for quite a long time. But we do feel that these things are important. Oh my God. Okay. Sorry, we needed a little bit of a shift for perspective. So this is Jeff. As I was saying, it's important to look at the division of two submissions of days in process before you can successfully register. And that is a serious issue. When we're looking at the ADQ, has 4 sort of basic requirements. 2 of them are in order to for an independent determination in respect to civil rights and access to telecommunications, as Lisa said in her discussion. So as we are looking at the URD, that causes some of this process where it becomes more about becoming a privilege, not a right. So if we're considering it as a civil right, that's one thing, but it's more about a privilege. In order to get it, you have to meet certain requirements. And that is something that is incredibly difficult. And I certainly, as Greg was saying, am frustrated. Convo, I wish that we had had more insight into that working group. Having had the experience with VRS and the URD. Convo, as Jeff owned and operated, we strongly oppose the URD because of concerns against privacy and interfering with private data. So we are absolutely concerned with privacy, and that is certainly a big challenge. The process itself is extremely complicated. As Greg said, it's absolutely right. And there is a great deal of uncertainty in that process. So for one small example of that, so the people who are responsible for administrating the URD, where are they? We don't see them here. I'm looking for them on the, they're perhaps looking at us on the live stream, that's possible. But in terms of people who are managing and administrating the URD, and people who are trying to make it work for providers and consumers, there is no transparency and no accountability. The providers are desperately trying to figure out what this process is in order to successfully get people registered and also get us compensated. And that's a big challenge that is part of our conversation in thinking about URD. So we're missing the compensation process, right? So what happens if the providers do not get paid? Which means that the services are at risk. For example, prior to the URD, we had no withholding, and we were very proud of that. You know, there was sort of some possible risk, but we eliminated that, and everything worked out ideally. With the URD, every month there is constant issues with withholding. And this is an issue that has failed again and again. And it's very difficult. As far as the remediation process, there is no transparency at all. We're trying to remediate the particular issues with the URD, and perhaps 1 year later, we're told, nope, that's the wrong person. That isn't the person that you should have spoken to about this remediation issue. And constantly on a monthly basis, we're trying to figure out what that process is, and the communication issues have become challenging. That is because, firstly, ROLCA is overwhelmed. The URD is expanding, and the ability to catch up and think about how we can process and going forward, and listening to this discussion and how we're able to ask the FCC what those processes are going forward. And the lack of transparency is causing a lot of questions and uncertainty with process and compensation. Second, we want to ask the FCC with what's going on, how to get that information. And so we are told to ask the administrator, and the administrator tells us to ask someone else. And there's a lot of going back and forth and passing that responsibility along, and we get a bit lost. So yes, I certainly agree that VRS has had an unfortunate experience with the URD. And I agree with all of Greg's comments. And I also feel strongly that the remediation and compensation process is missing from this particular recommendation, and that is a big part of this whole picture. So we want to think about where we have been and where we can go, but I do feel strongly that we should proceed with it and make that recommendation with our comments, and perhaps we could, through another approach, make comments to the FCC about some of these issues that have not been mentioned. I don't know if others want to weigh in on this, or other members want to weigh in on these particular issues, but I really want to thank the working group for your hard work and effort, and I think that we can make progress from what you've given us.
We are quickly running out of time, so I'd like to have one last comment from the floor from Paul before we proceed.
Thank you. Paul Schrader with IRA. I have two questions and a very brief comment. So one, and you may not be able to do this now, but I'm kind of missing the context as to why the IPCTS requires what appears to be a fairly onerous, I'm assuming it's a fraud prevention, but if you could help me understand why this registration issue is so convoluted and so process heavy. Question two, what is the implications for recommendation one, urging the commission or asking the commission not to publish the public notice that the URD is ready to accept? And then my general comment is I'm uncomfortable in this voting on a recommendation like this only because it is exceptionally detailed, which suggests the work group did a heck of a lot of good work. But I don't know that I know the implications of all of these details, and to walk through them, the time periods, the time frames, the level of ID required, the implications for the user, provider, carriers, et cetera. There's a lot here. I think, frankly, more than an advisory committee would typically take on. These seem like items that would be part of a regulatory process. In that sense, you've done the commission a great deal of work, so the commission staff should thank you. But I, as an advisor, as a member of the committee, find it a little uncomfortable to try to work through a recommendation with this level of detail. So to the extent that you can do anything on context and question the recommendation one, I would appreciate at least understanding why this issue is what it is.
I think we're going to turn it over to Will.
Hi. Hello. Hello. Hi, this is Will. Excellent conversation. I wanted to, because it seems like the conversation is going to go on for a moment, I just wanted to make a suggestion, and I'll leave it to Isidore, but my suggestion would be that if there are specific edits to be made now, we should probably take a quick break. Specific edits, if you want to suggest edits, then we should try to be as specific as possible so that we can make votes on that and have those details ready. And then also, I think in providing some more context, as Paul's asking for people maybe who aren't involved in the user registration database system, that might be also helpful. I just thought it would also be a good time to take a quick break. If there's specific edits, we can have those kind of crafted over that period, and then when we come back, we can start again. So I'll pass it back to Isidore to make that decision, but that's my suggestion.
Yes, thank you, Will. I'd like to ask Elliot to answer the one question about the greater context before we do a break. Oh, sorry, I wasn't on camera. Yeah, thanks, Will, for that suggestion. I would like to give Elliot an opportunity to briefly answer that question about the context, and then we will take a brief break before we continue the discussion once we come back. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this Elliot Greenwald. The original concept of the TRS-URD was developed in 2013 as part of the 2013 VRS reform order. And there was a lot of concern about misuse and abuse of VRS was the context of that discussion. And the idea of setting up a user registration database where the registration would be verified by the TRS administrator, the TRS-URD administrator, was to prevent the kinds of problems that were going on in VRS at that time, which was that there were some providers who were not appropriately checking the validity of people who were registering to use VRS. So this whole process was set up then. We do have some similar problems in IPCTS, and so this was extended to IPCTS in a more recent order. The thought was, and that was held off because the thought was, let's first get it done for VRS, and then we would look at it for, for IPCTS after that. So this series of recommendations are in the context that there's already been a process established for VRS and what the TRS Fund Administrator does in VRS, and the committee was looking into what can be done to improve upon the process, and these are the committee's recommendations. I can't really speak to the committee's recommendations. The chairs of the co-chairs of the committee will have to speak to that, but at least I can give you the history as to how we got to where we are now.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your patience. I think that we will take a 15-minute break, and so that means we will be back at 10:50, if I've got that right. I'm just trying to make sure I've got the time right. Yeah, 10:50. Thank you. All right, everybody. I think it is time for us all to come back together, if we could, to get the meeting started.
So you can install it for the entity, so that you can install it for the requirements of the organization, or for the person. That's why I'm confused.
That's right. So, it depends, but I would say it depends on the scenario. So, hospital, for example.
Hello. Hi.
If everyone could
Hello?
take their seats, please.
Hello.
The time is nigh.
Hi. Hello.
I
Hello,
miss
this
you all
is
so
Will.
much. Please head back to the table.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Hello. I don't think this is working.
It's not.
Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. This is Will. Could you take your seats?
For the administrator, right?
For the providers. Wait, no, it's for the doctors.
When we talk about providers, we're talking about.
Oh, so
I need one of those. I need like a projector.
Install them.
I don't think we've ever been seated near each other, so maybe we shouldn't.
So,
Yeah, everything's going okay.
Well, but
It
I
was
guess
a
the issue I'm
spirited
trying to
debate,
figure
so
out is,
you know.
this is talking
It's good.
about install the devices.
I haven't been tracking this as much, but I know that you guys have been very involved in CTO. In general, we're all so.
When Isidore calls on someone, can he make sure to say?
all right, is everyone ready to get started? We want to keep plowing forward.
The camera people want to follow.
I guess, am I going to have to do a dance to get everybody's attention here?
Let's.
That can't be.
But there's no rules don't allow it.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, we are ready to get started. I think we'll probably take one more minute and then we will continue. So please take your seats. So we're ready to move forward with our agenda.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay. All right, let's see. It looks like we have almost everyone back. Thank you all for making it back close to our planned time. I appreciate all of the discussion. I want to remind everyone of your ground rules. Please do wait until I recognize you as having the floor. Please state your name and then state your comments. We also ask that you keep them brief. Please try to keep your remarks or questions to 1 minute. We are fairly behind schedule on our agenda right now. Now, I'm not certain. I'm looking around the room to see if there's anyone with outstanding questions or comments before we move to a vote. Okay, I see one to my left here. So we will go with Michael Maddox. And Mike, please keep it brief and to the point, and then we will go back over to Paul on the other end of the table. So Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think it's important for the DAC to remember the very first recommendation involved here, which is to take all the remaining recommendations in the document out to a further notice of proposed rulemaking and to build a record about it. There have been 3 proposed amendments. I think the first 2 are very friendly and aren't very controversial, but this third one having to do with the expired identification, clearly there are different views on that one. And that's part of why we want to take all these items to further notice, to develop the record for the commission to make an informed and wise decision. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And now we'll take it to Paul at the other end of the table.
Paul Schrader with IRA. I just wanted the answer to my other question, which was what are the implications of recommendation 1, the commission not issuing the public notice? I don't quite understand what would happen. What happens in that instance should the commission agree to do that?
Okay, Elliot would like to respond to that.
I mean, what we will be doing once we receive whatever the DAC ends up voting on is we're going to take a look at each of the recommendations pretty carefully, and we'll figure out, once we take a look at it, we'll figure out what we think is feasible to do administratively, what may require, what would make sense to put into a NPRM, what may, what we may not want to accept. There may be a few that we decide we don't want to accept, but we're going to look at each one pretty carefully once we get them. So exactly what happens with each of them after that, we can't tell you now because we have to take a look at it and figure it out and talk to the, the TRS URD administrator, get their take on it, and work it through and figure it out internally.
Okay, I would like to go to Lisa Hamlin, who I think would like to respond. Sorry, now that we have the camera, I'd like to send it to Lisa Hamlin if you'd like to respond.
So, this is Lisa Hamlin. I'm actually going to turn it. I think what Paul is really asking is, what does that particular recommendation mean? What would change? What would happen? Am I right, Paul? Yeah. Okay. So I want to turn that to Michael because I think he'd be able to explain it a little bit better, just so you have an idea about what was our concept with that.
Thank you, Lisa. So the general reason why we're asking that the public notice not be issued is, frankly, from a processing standpoint, once the public notice is issued that the URD is live and accepting registration, that implies that the URD administrator has finished all the development, the processes are formalized and put in place, and frankly, the time clock starts in terms of how long providers have to get customers registered. So in short, we're asking that that public notice not get released until all of the recommendations that we've submitted in this document are considered through a rulemaking proceeding, because they will impact the development of the URD for IPCTS, as well as timeframes and other implications once that public notice is issued. Does that help?
Okay, thank you. I think, Lisa, you'd like to take it back?
This is Lisa Hamlin. So during the break, we did what we were asked and did a little sidebar on trying to figure out how to make the amendments to make folks here comfortable with voting on this amendment. And the compromise we came up with, so we're looking at the issue of the driver expired identification documents, and that's on page 6, DI. Now, I would also ask, because this would be an amendment, it would have to be voted on to be considered. Again, Will is nodding his head, so I'm saying the right thing. And I would ask, though, that it be this particular one on driver ed be voted on separately from the subsequent amendment, which is pretty much just trying to make it into English that people understand. This one's more substantial. So I would ask if the chair would entertain the amendment separately. Can we do that?
I believe you can. Will, I don't know if you want to weigh in to answer that question.
This is Will. I think that sounds like a good process to go through. What I think you're saying, Lisa, is that you want to have the voter ID amendment addressed first, and then the two other, which you believe are less controversial, or the potential for less controversy, you would like those to be addressed together separately. I think if that's what you're proposing, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, Lisa, do you
Yes.
want to continue?
Yes, this is Lisa Hamlin again. So the proposed amendment for, on page 6, recommendation 2, D, Roman numeral 1, excuse me, just the D, what we would revise would, instead of saying revise the list of validation documentation to, we would excise that and say instead for D, through a rulemaking procedure, the Commission should determine what shall be considered valid documentation. For example, just like that, and then leave the 3 in there as possible ways for the FCC, for the Commission to approach it. But we're not saying this is what you should do. These are examples of how you could address it. So I'll read it again to make sure people, you're sort of listening to me on the fly, so let me read that one more time. D, through a rulemaking procedure, the Commission should determine what shall be considered valid documentation. For example, colon. So I put that back to the chair.
Okay, is there a second to that amendment? Do we have a second to the amendment? Okay, Brian Traeger. And now we will proceed with a vote on that amendment. Or, so is there?
I have something, but not related to this particular amendment. So once we've gone through this, you can return to me, please.
Okay, great. So with that, I guess we'll start to my left with the first voting member, Sarah.
Is there an option to abstain? Is there an option to abstain?
Yes.
Abstain.
National Captioning Institute votes yes.
Sorensen Communications votes no.
Clear Captions votes yes.
Hamilton Relay votes yes.
T-Mobile abstains.
ACB abstains.
NAB abstains.
Nazara votes yes.
Level Access votes yes.
National Federation of the Blind votes yes.
Move on.
Access Board ex officio abstain.
Hearing Loss Association of America votes yes.
GupTA abstains.
Gallaudet votes yes.
U.S. Department of Education is ex officio. We abstain. NTID votes yes. NAD votes yes. TDI votes yes. Convo votes yes.
City of Boston votes yes.
VITAC votes yes.
Verizon votes yes.
AT&T votes yes.
IRA abstains.
CTIA votes yes.
CTA votes yes.
Audio Description Associates abstains.
Sprint votes yes.
Apple votes yes.
ACT, the App Association, votes yes.
The amendment passes. Thank you. Now, with that aside, we can move to the motion to vote on the recommendation. We had two amendments, is that right, Lisa? Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
This is Lisa Hamlin. There was, in fact, there was a third recommendation. We resolved on a sidebar on one more amendment, but the third was kind of up in the air still. So I'm going to let Tim speak to that if he wants to amend. But we did resolve for page 7. So this is under, let me look back here. Recommendation 2, letter G. So right now it reads, resolve all user registration appeals within 30 days. We are, the proposed amendment would be resolve all user registration appeals within 30 days of the initial submission of the appeal. Resolve all user registration appeals within 30 days of the initial submission of the appeal.
This is Isidore. Looks like Jeff has a question or comment.
Yes, I have a comment.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I'm playing a bit of musical chairs here to get a good view. So this is Jeff Rosen with Convo. I just wanted to comment that, for the record, I want to emphasize that I think that the recommendation is wonderful, and I want to pass it with the understanding of improving the processes, and I support that part of the recommendation. Through our experience with the URD, we have serious concerns about the compensation process, and we think that that is a key part of the URD, how people are compensated and therefore are provided services. And it's possible that that would affect or impact the service. So we want to see some more discussion on what those processes are, and I want to make that comment for the record that firstly, it is important to focus on compensation and the process itself because I feel it's broken at the moment. Greg Klybach, who unfortunately had to leave, he requested that I also comment that specifically the URD processes should be considered, and when we are making determinations about that payment compensation process, the way that it currently stands is not effective. In terms of delays and what we're looking at on the monthly level. So this is certainly an unresolved issue that we wanted to put forward. So both of those things I wanted to put on the record before we proceed with this recommendation. Thank you.
This is Isidore speaking. Thank you, Jeff. Now I will turn it back over to Lisa. And I think that we're looking for a motion to vote on this second amendment. Does anyone have the initial motion?
We need a second.
Oh, I see. So we're... Okay, I'm sorry. We'll back up one more time. So what I need is a second on this second amendment to the recommendation.
Sure.
And let's see. I'm trying to see who we have. A second. We have a second by Carl. Carl Richardson. Thank you, Carl. Now we'll proceed to a vote again, and we will start as we did with Sarah.
The American Foundation for the Blind votes yes.
National Captioning Institute votes yes.
Sorensen Communications votes yes.
Clear Captions votes yes.
Hamilton Relay votes yes. T-Mobile abstains.
ACB votes yes.
NAB abstains.
Nazara votes yes.
Level Access votes yes.
National Federation of the Blind votes yes.
FEMA abstain.
Access Board ex officio abstain.
Hearing Loss Association of America votes yes.
DCAPTA abstains.
Gallaudet votes yes.
U.S. Department of Education abstains. NTID votes yes. NAD votes yes. TDI votes yes. Convo votes yes.
City of Boston votes yes.
VITAC votes yes.
Verizon votes yes.
AT&T votes yes.
IRA abstains.
CTIA votes yes.
CTA votes yes.
Audio Description Associates abstains.
Sprint votes yes.
Apple votes yes.
ACT the App Association votes yes.
NBDA votes yes. And the amendment passes. Thank you. Wow. So then back over to Lisa for, did you say there is another amendment?
This is Lisa Hamlin. The third amendment has been withdrawn. So from our perspective, there's no more amendments. I don't know if there are any more. And can, for a moment, I missed whether the First Amendment passed or not.
Yes.
Okay, so it's back to the chair for a vote on the amended doc.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to request the motion to vote on the recommendation with all amendments. Carl, you move?
I so move.
Okay. And so then we can proceed with the voting. We'll start again with Sarah.
The American Foundation for the Blind votes yes.
National Captioning Institute votes yes.
Sorensen Communications votes yes.
Clear Captions votes yes.
Hamilton Relay votes yes. T-Mobile abstains.
ACB votes yes.
NAB votes yes.
Nazara votes yes.
Level Access votes yes.
National Federation of the Blind votes yes.
FEMA abstains.
U.S. Access Board ex officio abstains.
Hearing Loss Association of America votes yes.
DCAPTA abstains.
Gallaudet votes yes.
U.S. Department of Education abstains. NTID votes yes. NAD votes yes. TDI votes yes. Convo votes yes.
City of Boston votes yes.
VITAC votes yes.
Verizon votes yes.
AT&T votes yes.
Ira abstains.
CTIA votes yes.
CTA votes yes.
Audio Description Associates abstains.
Sprint votes yes.
Apple votes yes.
ACT, the App Association, votes yes.
NBDA, yes. And thank you, the motion passes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. All right, now we will proceed with our agenda. Next, we will be getting a report from the Best Practices for Access to Live Programming in Smaller Markets Working Group with co-chairs Christian Vogler from Gallaudet University and Heather York with VITAC. Heather?
Thank you. Am I on? I'm on. Thanks. So this is a really quick update. It'll take seconds. We don't have a recommendation, but we do have things to share. The Access to Live Programming Working Group was tasked with the following. Develop recommendations on best practices for the implementation and use of enhanced electronic newsroom technique and other technologies for captioning of and improving access to local news and other live television programming, and on effective industry and consumer outreach and education. The full group has met every other week since the last meeting of the DAC, with weekly meetings by a drafting committee created to craft the language of a recommendation. We heard from captioning providers, ASR providers, ENT experts, and journalists. While we're close to a final recommendation, we've not finished our task and will be continuing to move forward in the coming months. Important updates include the following. First, nothing in our recommendation is intended to prejudice the Commission's consideration of a pending petition for declaratory rulemaking from consumer groups and accessibility researchers, which proposes to phase out the use of best practices in favor of technology-neutral metrics for evaluating caption quality or any other matters presently pending before the Commission. Second, electronic newsroom technique is available to TV stations outside of the top 25 markets and non-Big Four stations in all makeup markets, and use teleprompter scripts to create captions. The committee recognizes that if live interviews, live on the scene, or breaking news segments are not scripted, ENT might not accommodate these situations. Our recommendations do not take a position on the use of ASR for unscripted programming because it is a topic that is within the scope of the above referenced petition. Without expressing any opinion on whether ASR should or could be used to supplement unscripted portions of the ENT caption programming, the committee agrees that there are limited other options for supplementing such programming with textual information. For example, stations often use graphics and crawls to convey the content for some but not all unscripted portions of ENT caption programming. I realize I read that very fast. We are currently working on an ENT coordinator toolkit, which will be shared by the FCC and distributed to each broadcast station's ENT coordinator and backup. This education module includes a summary of current best practices and tips for creating the best quality captions possible in the ENT environment. We used as the basis for this toolkit a similar module created by the NAB to educate broadcasters about accessible news programming for people who are blind or low vision. The toolkit will urge coordinators to consider the effects of the text they create for captions and will include real-life video samples demonstrating the proper caption practices. Joshua Pila of the NAB and Dan Shelley of RTDNA have created the scripts, which were approved by the working group on Monday and will begin filming the short video segments on March 3rd. It is our plan to approve the final recommendation, including the videos and toolkit, by early April and bring the full recommendation along with the toolkit and video samples to the next DAC meeting for a vote. The group has worked hard at creating a useful and actionable recommendation, and the chairs would like to thank everyone for their hard work and participation. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you for that update on your progress with the working group, Heather. And if we have no questions, I'd like to move on to our next agenda item.
I gotta stop talking so fast.
Will?
But thank you.
Hello. Hi, this is Will. I just want to make a quick comment that I think we can push the public participation part back a little bit so that we can have the a brief discussion on that's listed in the agenda. So I just wanted to let everyone know that we'll push the public participation back just a little bit. We'll squeeze it right in towards the end. So.
Thank you, Will. So at this point, I'd like to invite Paul Schroeder for his presentation on artificial intelligence and how that would impact people with disabilities.
Stop taking my microphone. I paid for this microphone. Those legendary words. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about AI, artificial intelligence, and hopefully have a bit of a discussion. I think Will picked on me because the first two letters in IRA are derived from artificial intelligence. That was has always been a part of what IRA intends to use in providing our service, which, as a reminder, is a service that connects people who are blind with remote trained assistants who can provide access to visual information using a smartphone app and the phone camera. There is, of course, a lot of opportunity for using artificial intelligence in that approach. A couple of points. The FCC has looked at this issue a little bit, and I think it's interesting for us to contemplate whether there is a DAC role to play. At a forum on artificial intelligence, Chairman Pai talked about the need for regulatory humility when looking at this emerging technology with respect to the FCC's role, and I presume perhaps other agencies as well. But he also talked about the value of spectrum management, utilization, potentially leading to enhanced opportunities not only for disability accessibility, but for access to broadband across the country. Let's talk just briefly about AI. Sometimes people will also hear machine learning and natural language processing. In fact, this dovetails actually kind of nicely on the report that Heather and her group just gave. AI has to do at its general level, its most basic level, with making technology smarter and adding learning capability to it. Machine learning is a subset or a part of AI, and it often is used interchangeably because machine learning is the process by which technologies are able to learn and improve what they're capable of doing. Often deep learning is a term that you'll hear thrown around in the technology industry to talk about what machine learning can do. Examples, fairly obvious ones like the Amazon or other engines that say, if you like this, you might also like. The process for learning and making technology smarter tends to require a lot of data. And I'll talk in a minute about some implications around that. But it tends to require a lot of data, and then utilizing that data through algorithms to hopefully do something useful. Prediction, of course, is another one that many of us probably use. Automated speech recognition, ASR, we just had a little comment on that. Natural language processing is often involved in this conversation as well. ASR, of course, being the processing of speech. And natural language processing is the processing of text or speech and with the ability to understand or making it more understandable. A couple of points about why AI is relevant for the disability community and some implications for how it's being used now. I mentioned our service, IRA. And we have a keen interest in the work that is happening around object and image recognition. That's part of AI. That is technology that is able to identify what objects are or what images are. And many entities are beginning to look at this for wayfinding capability. That is to say, providing information about the environment, providing directives and clues for what one can do in the environment, what's around you, and to the extent that that can be done through automated means, through object recognition means using technology, it means less use of an Aira agent, for example, in our case, which then makes it possible to provide the service to more people because agents aren't needed, aren't being paid, but also aren't being asked to provide the information, providing a much broader opportunity for technology to be used. Auto captions, I think that's fairly understandable in this group, and one that's probably worth some conversation with respect to the relevance of AI. Autonomous vehicles is raised a lot in the disability community, of course, not only for personal transportation, but also for what it might do for public transportation. And I'm told that there are even companies looking at adding autonomous navigation capabilities to power wheelchairs, allowing more opportunity for individuals with disabilities to take advantage of automated navigation. Language processing, of course, could also be utilized for people with cognitive disabilities. The IBM Ability Labs was a Chairman's Award winner for the FCC in the Content Clarifier product. And that is a product that uses all of these systems, AI, machine learning, natural language processing, to simplify, summarize, augment content, digital content, to make it more understandable for people with various disabilities or various needs, and also for people learning English as a second language, for example. So a couple of, I want to talk for just a second about AI and FCC implications, and then I'll talk about a couple of cautions and concerns and then kick it open. So AI, as we understand it in industry, and I think as you start to think about it, tends to require a lot of connectivity. So I mentioned data, and that data has to come from somewhere. It also has to be generated and transmitted and be able to be utilized. So the importance of cloud and cloud processing, meaning it's in the metaphorical cloud, as well as mobile connectivity. 5G often is talked about as a potential driver of AI, is really important for the kinds of use cases that I just talked about. The autonomous vehicle, the wayfinding, any of those activities have a high degree of demand on the communication system, cloud and mobile. 5G spectrum utilization as well is an issue that does come up quite a bit in discussions of AI and how it will be most broadly utilized. And so I would certainly invite anyone to chime in on that topic. Summarize a couple of concerns and cautions that have come up, and I think these are kind of where it's critical for our discussions. The inclusion of individuals with a variety of disabilities. So when we talk about data sets, if we don't have a wide selection and implementation of data that reflects the needs of people with a variety of disabilities, we will simply manifest in any kind of artificial intelligent technologies the same biases and results that we have broadly in our society, where the needs of individuals with disabilities are not sufficiently handled. In fact, if we have insufficient inclusion, we will just recreate those barriers. The same time, though, the need for data and the need to inject, if you will, data and the issues of importance to people with disabilities also leads us to a privacy concern. And there are a great many people concerned about the loss of privacy, not only for people with disabilities, but for anyone else as we collect and utilize data. This issue has certainly come up at Aira, and I know it comes up in many other technology industries as well, where there is a great deal of concern about the implications of knowing as much as technology can know, and the industries who run technology can know about individuals, their habits, their purchasing habits, their travel habits, et cetera. So we've got this need for data and coming from a variety of groups, but we at the same time have this concern about privacy. The excessive demand on spectrum from the proliferation of sensors, devices, all of these things that will rely on and feed data into the system is one that is worth considering. Maybe not specifically a disability advisory committee topic, but certainly one that I'm sure the FCC has some concern about. And then there's sort of just the general sense of overhype and underinvestment in meeting real needs. Many, I think, rightly express the concern that artificial intelligence probably will focus more on needs related to money, buying and selling, than it will on actually meeting real human needs. And I think there is a relevant concern there. And certainly those of us in the disability community can speak to that. Last thing I will mention is if we don't, taking Chairman Pai's comment about regulatory humility seriously, of course, we also need to balance that with the recognition that we have from the disability community that without standards and requirements, often our needs are not met. I am reminded of the Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth, who probably takes a backseat to no one when it comes to regulatory humility, who also acknowledged that sometimes markets simply don't meet the needs of people, and acknowledging that they didn't meet the needs of people with disabilities. And by the way, February, we are now the 24th anniversary of the 1996 Communications Act rewrite, which you left out, was left out of our group of laws that we're celebrating anniversaries of. And I want to say it was like 10th or 11th of February, so sometime this month. So that's it. Those are sort of my opening comments, and I would certainly invite, I know I've talked to a couple of folks in the room to see if they want to chime in first. You certainly can raise and signal for the chair to recognize you if you wish.
Thank you, Paul, for that presentation. I appreciate that. And yeah, I see Gay Jones, and then we can go over to Sarah. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm corrected. Sarah will be first, and then we'll go to Gay Jones. Okay, we've got a lot of tent cards up, but so wait, we'll go to Gay Jones.
Hi, this is Gay Jones with FEMA. I know it's a federal agency. Many federal agencies are looking at AI, and they're looking at implementing a lot of these data-driven pieces to it. Specifically, when FEMA is very unique in terms of we have a registration process, and we are looking at how we can make this product more in tune with the artificial intelligence world. Here's my concern. It is very voice and hearing driven. And a lot of times when you get into those systems that have already been developed, they are not accessible to people who have hearing and speech disabilities. And the menu items and all of those things that you go into AI replacing. I was in a meeting one time, and they were doing a presentation by folks that had all these nice little shiny products of IA and AI. Excuse me if I say IA, because that's an acronym at FEMA for individual assistance. So just replace that opposite. The concern that I have is I asked them how they were building accessibility into the product that, changing a registration process. And I kid you not, the answer was they didn't understand what accessibility was, number one. And number two, somebody had to kind of pipe up. It was about deaf and hard of hearing, which it is not. And the dark answer was we will send them to the TTY. Folks have got to understand that the TTY is gone. It is not a digital product. RTT is. And so when I think about AI, what are we doing to ensure that accessibility is built into those systems, particularly in systems in the federal government where people have to access it and there are people with disabilities to do that? Maybe I'm off guard here, but that seems to be one of the bigger issues that I'm encountering at this point.
If I might briefly respond, and then others want to chime in, that's great. Is that acceptable?
Yes, go ahead.
So two things. One is one of the points that I have found in doing some research in this topic. You mentioned speech-driven products, for example, and this really does drive the point of why more data and data from a variety of sources is critical, because my understanding is that in fact some of those speech-driven, the smart speaker type products have actually become less adept at a variance of speech as they have received more data, because that data has tended to become driving them away from sort of outliers. As to the federal government, I can't speak to that, but I mean, I think the whole point of today's conversation is to kind of raise issues and determine. I won't speak for the will in the DAC, but it seems perhaps the point would be to see if there's some topics that we ought to consider more broadly, or in more specific terms here in the committee.
Great, thank you. I would like to recognize Sarah. Did you have a question?
Yes, this is Sarah from the American Foundation for the Blind. And I appreciate this conversation. I know that AI presents a lot of opportunities for people with disabilities, and similar to Gay's point, would like to reemphasize, how we adopt technologies, and as we do so, consider measures of safety, reliability, and privacy, and determine what are acceptable levels of risk, and specifically, how are we building awareness with individuals, consumers, groups, doing outreach, and obtaining consent and agreement on those levels of risk, both at an individual level, one individual's consent to provide their data, and on group levels as we create sort of a broader societal understanding or sub-societal understanding of how risk for people with disabilities might balance the desire for innovation, the desire for new opportunity, against the possibility that new technology may not be fully tested, or may require a significant intrusion on personal privacy. So I think that's an important consideration to keep in mind throughout these discussions.
I would simply say, well stated, and there's a lot of federal and state legislation, as you know, looking at privacy, consumer privacy, trying to balance that with the needs of industry and in fact the needs of consumers to benefit from data and AI-driven algorithm processes that support consumer needs. So good stuff. And again, I'm sure that these are all conversations that we could tackle with various work groups.
Great, thank you so much for your discussions. We have 5 more minutes left, so I'd like to recognize Joel and his comment.
Great, thank you. Am I on? Thank you. Thanks, Paul. That was great, and I fully appreciate the ability of AI to be quite useful in, as you say, identifying objects or object recognition. I'm coming at all of this from an audio description standpoint, as you can imagine, and I firmly believe in the words of the French writer Paul Valéry, seeing is forgetting the name of what one sees. Object recognition is great for names and for labels, but to provide a description, something that in some cases is going to be quite valuable and necessary even to somebody who's blind, you have to, I believe it's more of a human element, and I'm not sure AI will get to that in my lifetime, the capacity to go beyond the label, the name, and actually describe. And I think that capacity would be very valuable. Right now, I think it's something that humans can provide, trained audio describers can provide well.
Great, thank you. Tony, and then we will go over to Claude. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, as always, thanks for bringing this conversation to the table, as it were. ACB, as folks know, I mean, with our work in autonomous vehicle space and other spaces, you know, and with Ira and a lot of the folks around this table even, you know, knows that for us, it's huge opportunities in the horizon, excellent opportunities for innovation. We encourage anybody who moves towards that, again, a lot of the folks around the tables, particularly in the telecom space, for really helping build open the systems that are going to push this data, right, and store this data and communicate this data and do it with low latency and all the things we need to be effective. This is a conversation maybe just as you know, for a later time. In that conversation is how do we treat what has been traditionally two-way communications in terms of an interest in this building when we are no longer having two humans at either side of a conversation. And in the sense of AI, you know, Google presented their AI where they had the person that had fooled someone over the phone about scheduling a haircut. Folks would check that out on YouTube. It's quite eerie in a sense of the capabilities that AI can really, in a sense, act as another person on the other end of the line. But how do we treat that? And I'm thinking specifically around advanced communication systems, you know, where we, in a sense, are communicating, is the person on the other end actually human or not? And what, in a sense, are the obligations that fall under that in assuring that a communications pipeline is fully accessible for folks across the line? So just something to think about maybe down the road for another conversation in this table or perhaps over a pint of beer one night at a pub.
We're going to request beer for the next DAC. I think that seems appropriate.
Thank you so much for your perspective. So let's wrap up with Claude. Last is Claude.
Thank you. Too bad. Okay, are we ready now? All right, too bad. I would like to drink a beer here. I'm the IPA kind of guy. I do want to thank Paul for his presentation about AI. I think that we don't have a deaf-blind representative here, but I'm going to try and speak for them. I can't really speak for them, but I do want to be in support of them. So I do hope, Paul, that we arrive to a point where Ira is able to communicate with the deaf-blind community, where they're able to benefit from your technology as well. And I think that their world that we have in front of us is connective for their devices in the future. And I would like for people to be able to experience that sort of connective world that we have here. I think that that world is here. For instance, that yellow board, they have this experience of getting text and being able to see some things and so forth. There are certain glasses people can put on to understand what they need to do in order to be effective within their world. Using AI would be able to improve their abilities to access resources and so forth. They cannot find jobs. Deaf-blind individuals sit at home and we need to think about them as we go through with our work.
I can just close the comment. Paul Schrader with IRA. So thank you for all these comments. I think, and I'll just answer you, Claude, to say that individuals can use IRA with two-way text capability, meaning that individuals who are deafblind actually can use IRA if they have a device that will support communication in a text form, Braille or otherwise. This topic is a fascinating one. I think Tony and others have raised some very interesting implications, and one that probably does warrant some time, not only by the FCC, but certainly by the Disability Advisory Committee. Companies like ours and others that are doing wearables and providing so much massive information at one's fingertips.
Sorry, Paul, to interrupt. We can certainly talk about this fascinating topic all day. We do need to make sure that we keep to our agenda. We're quickly running out of time, and we do have one more person who wanted to make a comment.
If I could just close, massive technology at fingertips, but it also means massive intrusion, as others have indicated. So lots of good fodder for conversation, and thank you for the time.
Sure, great, thank you. And then Jeff, you'll be our last.
Wonderful. This is Jeff Rosen from Convo again. Thank you, Paul, for leading this discussion. I think that it's been a good discussion, but one thing I did want to emphasize is that we need to think about here with the FCC is to ensure that the safety and security of people calling 911, using AI to be able to see locations and so forth, and if these people are moving. I understand information, data collection, and all of that is a complicated issue that's being discussed, but I think that it's very possible that there are some technology within AI that could apply to these emergency situations when people just are unable to communicate, that happen regularly, where they call 911, try and connect 911, but then they're not able to find the person's location, where they are, or they're unable to communicate. An AI might be able to be a suggestion to the FCC that could help lead them in the right direction.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate that. Interesting discussion, one that we can certainly continue to get into. And now we are moving into our time for public participation in the meeting. Will?
Hello, everyone. This is Will. If you are sitting in the audience here within the room, there is a microphone available. It's on a stand in between the two doors. Before we get to the line that's forming, I just want to provide a public comment that was given to us online. Marissa Rivera asks, she would like the Disability Advisory Committee to please look at the compatibility of TTYs and phone systems in the correctional system. She says that usually there is an additional step of people having to enter their inmate ID and having to guess what is being said on the phone, then make the call to a relay center. Marissa's understanding is that this process is not accessible to TTY users in the correctional system. And in response to the answer, I'll pass this over to Deborah Patkin, who is the deputy designated federal officer, but also an attorney in the Disability Rights Office.
Hi, as Will said, I'm Deborah, and I'm going to give the answer to Marissa Rivera's question. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, protects people with disabilities from discrimination in state and local government services, programs, and activities, including those provided by state and local jails, prisons, or other types of juvenile or adult detention and corrections facilities. The ADA generally requires these entities to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to and an equal opportunity to participate in and benefit from these services, including phone services that those entities are providing. Those obligations may require, for example, making reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures which may resolve the accessibility barrier that you described, Ms. Rivera. Questions about the implementation of these and other ADA requirements should be directed to the U.S. Department of Justice. You can visit www.ada.gov or call the ADA information line. That phone number is 1-800-514-0301 as the voice number, or 1-800-514-0383, the TTY number. As an aside, we would like to note two things. First, federal law requires every common carrier that provides voice services to offer access to TRS within their service areas. And this requirement does extend to and include inmate calling services, also referred to as ICS providers. Second, the FCC does have a mandate for accessibility reports about TTY problems for annual calling service reports. In order released in 2015, the Commission, and more specifically the Wireline Competition Bureau, outlined requirements designed to assist the Commission in monitoring rates, fees, and practices of ICS providers. Specifically, ICS providers must submit annual reporting and certification forms to the Commission. One piece of information that must be reported is the number of problems the provider is aware of related to the provision of TTY-based calls during that reporting period. These problems could include, for example, dropped calls or calls with poor quality connections. And for more information about that, you can visit www.fcc.gov/general/ICS-data-collections. Thanks.
This is Will. Thank you, Deborah. Please tell me if anyone else sees someone standing at the microphone. I don't see anybody. With that, the public comment period will come to a close. There are no more online public comments. So I'll move what's next on the agenda? Closing remarks. Closing remarks, I'll pass it back to Co-Chair Isidore and Brian.
Thank you, everyone. In closing, I just want to thank everyone for all of your hard work and dedication to serving as representatives for your organizations here. Is really critical for us to fulfill our obligations here as members of the committee to advise the Commission on matters of accessibility. I want to announce that we will be having our next meeting on May 28th. And I believe that is a Thursday. Thank you, Deborah. And with that, I believe that we will be able to adjourn for now and enjoy your lunch, which has been graciously provided by ACT, the App Association. Thank you, Brian and ACT, and see you all in May.